Homeostasis is the process by which the body maintains an optimum internal environment, and it responds to both internal stressors inside the body, such as in the blood, and external stressors outside the body, such as extreme temperatures, both on the cold and hot side in the environment. It involves negative feedback, which is a three-step process, starting with a receptor that will detect the stressor and tell that to the control center, that will then signal the effector to execute an appropriate response. In thermoregulation, there can be two effectors that can be quite similar and therefore confusing. So let's look at them. There's vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So vasoconstriction, as the blood vessel is tightened, it decreases blood flow, and when this happens in the core, it can help in hot conditions to prevent more blood flow and hence higher temperature in the whole body. And in cold conditions, it prevents heat loss because this is more constricted, so there's less loss of heat outside of the blood vessel. Vasodilation, on the other hand, is quite the opposite, so it has more blood flow because it's more expanded, and hence in cold conditions where we want a higher overall body temperature, we want to vasodilate the blood vessels in the core. And it also involves more heat loss, as shown by these arrows, because the blood is closer to the surface and hence there is, well, more heat loss. And this is ideal for hot conditions to release the heat and decrease overall body temperature. The optimum body temperature is around 37 degrees Celsius, and when thermoreceptors detect a decrease in temperature, the hypothalamus will be informed as the control center and will take out the following effectors. Just have in mind that metabolic rate here means the amount of chemical reactions occurring in the body, so when we increase it, we can increase the overall body temperature, which is ideal for cold conditions. In hot conditions, have in mind that sweat is also involved. You probably already knew this, but it works because it evaporates on the skin, hence cooling it down. You also need to know these facts, so we have the different methods of measuring one's body temperature, the different ways in which heat is transferred out of the body or lost. Let's look at the different systems involved in thermoregulation. So as we saw before, there's the system of the skin, also known as the integumentary system, that involves the erector pili muscles that we saw before that cause our goosebumps and the nerve endings that contain thermoreceptors. There's also the muscular system that involves the involuntary contraction of, for example, skeletal muscles that cause our shivering, the nervous system used to communicate, and the endocrine system that we will look at later. For the factors impacting one's thermoregulation, let's look at sex. So females in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle tend to have increases in progesterone, and this causes effects of thermoregulation. And we also know that males tend to have higher metabolic rates, and this increases their production of heat. The heart can be regulated through external structures that are not actually within it. So an example of this would be the cardiac nerve, responsible for sympathetic stimulation, so increasing heart rate, and it is stimulated by the hormone epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. Then there's the vagus nerve, responsible for the opposite function, this time stimulated by acetylcholine, the hormone. It sounds like a movie title, but so it controls an extrinsic communication from the cardiac control center of the brain and the sinoatrial node that we'll look at of the heart. Now looking at the intrinsic or interior excitation or regulation of the heart, we start with the sinoatrial node, also involved in receiving messages from the cardiac and vagus nerve that we saw before. So its role is to cause a simultaneous atrial contraction, so a contraction that happens at the same time in both ventricles. Then we have the atrioventricular node that will briefly delay the impulse generated by the sinoatrial node so that the ventricles are full of blood before pumping. What actually causes the pump is the AV node sends a message down the bundle of His that then gets sent to the Purkinje fibers next to the ventricles. And remember that the ventricles contract simultaneously as well. Moving on to blood sugar levels or blood glucose levels, we have that when you eat, they will increase, and hence the receptor will be the pancreas, and also the control center. So it essentially controls and causes the effectors to take place thanks to its insulin secretion. So what insulin will do is stimulate a process called glycogenesis, which is essentially turning the glucose that has just increased into glycogen and therefore decreasing the overall levels in the blood. Next, we have what happens when you exercise. The opposite process will take place. So the muscle cells will absorb the glucose, so it will naturally decrease. And another thing that exercise does is increase insulin sensitivity, okay? So the receptor and control center is the same. This time the pancreas secretes the hormone glucagon that does the opposite effect of insulin, and it will stimulate glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. It's important to memorize these well because they can be pretty confusing, but both of them involve the production of glucose. So then both of these processes will lead back to the optimal blood glucose levels. Remember I mentioned before that exercise increases insulin sensitivity. So this has a lot to do with diabetes. So we have type 1, which isn't really relevant to exercise, but it's important to know that it's when the body cannot produce insulin. Then we have the separate problem of type 2 diabetes. This time the body has an insulin insensitivity, also known as resistance. So exercise is good to play an opposite effect, like a cure to this type 2 diabetes, because of the absorption of glucose and increasing insulin sensitivity, as I said before. And a sedentary lifestyle, so that doesn't involve exercise, as well as processed foods that spike our blood sugar levels, will contribute to this disease. The optimum pH is around this range. You don't need to know a specific unit, though I think it does exist. So when you exercise, the CO2 and the lactic acid that are in the blood will cause the pH to lower under this range, and this will cause it to be too acidic for our enzymes. If you do biology, you'll know that enzymes have an optimum pH, and hence when it is too acidic for these enzymes, they will be denatured and they will not function as they should. So the receptor in this case is the chemoreceptor, and the control center is the cardiac control center, because it will increase the heart rate to remove the lactic acid and the tidal volume to remove the CO2. So when in cases where the pH increases, you don't need to know a clear case where this happens, due to low CO2 levels, the enzymes will also be denatured, in this case because it is too alkali. So the receptor and control center is the same. The effectors this time will be the opposite, so the tidal volume will decrease, so the CO2 goes back up again, and hence it becomes less alkali. The optimum range for blood pressure, this case, is this one. So 120 would be the systolic blood pressure and 80 would be the diastolic blood pressure. So this is very important, relevant. The formula for blood pressure is the following, and when you exercise, blood pressure will increase as logical. This will be detected by baroreceptors, and the cardiac control center is the control center. And the effectors this time are that heart rate decreases. This happens after the exercise, okay? So this would be post exercise. I can't bother writing it. Because the heart rate decreases again, this reduces the cardiac output. So if we have less cardiac output, this means we have less blood pressure based on the formula. The resistance also has to go down to decrease blood pressure, and this is done by vasodilating blood vessels. So because they are more dilated and expanded, there's less pressure, it's less tight. Hope that makes sense. So in cases where blood pressure decreases, the opposite is going to happen. So the heart rate will increase to increase the cardiac output and hence the blood pressure, and the blood vessels will vasoconstrict this time to increase the resistance. They will tighten up.